Hello everybody and welcome to Civilization 6, one of the best 4X historical strategy games in the market. Today I'm playing with the anthology version and I'm going to tell you about what I wish I knew before I started playing Civilization 6. This video is therefore meant for beginners but also more intermediate players. Perhaps you're returning to Civilization 6 after a break or simply need to be reminded of what makes a really great Civilization 6 campaign. Without any further ado, let's begin. And I think it makes sense to start small and work our way up. There'll be time cards below, but to begin with, here you can see me settling my city. And my first point is really about production. Production is everything. Now, in this specific case, you'll notice that I settled on the city and that removed the woods that were there, losing me a production. But by and large, of course, we're looking for tiles that have extra production. This is a terrible example of a city because it really doesn't have a lot of production around it, and I removed its only source. Production is everything in Civilization 6, and you'll see that later in this video as well. Something that I often mistake is beelining for other resources like food or potentially a tile with a yield or an incense or some cotton, some kind of luxury resource that looks good but doesn't actually provide me anything within the first 10, 20, 30 turns. It's really a better idea to focus on the fact that production is everything. Which also slides me through nicely into my second point. Ditch the scouts. The scouts are not your friend. And ironically, I just found a scout using my warrior. The point here that I'm trying to make is that you can actually easily scout out the map generally without building a single scout. And this is general advice, bear that in mind. I find it's a much better idea to train warriors or, as you'll see, slingers. I think slingers are the best bang for your buck. Sure, you won't quite be able to explore as well as a scout. You'll be slightly more limited in your maneuverability. You will still be able to get out and explore the world. You'll start with your warrior, like I have here, and be able to use that to explore kind of nearby-ish to your capital. Close enough that you can bring it back if things get really desperate, but it should be able to venture out far enough that you can find those tribal goody huts, like what you saw me do earlier in the video. If you can find those goody huts, you might just luck your way into a scout anyway. Would I rely on that? No. But my recommended strategy is to build at least one slinger, ideally two, and explore with your warrior. That will give you 3 units to explore the nearby area. It'll be enough to potentially meet friends or foes as well, like you just saw me do, as well as, of course, meet the city-states, because there is value in exploring early, not just sending your slingers out to hope to luck into a scout or envoys or anything else that you can get from those goody huts. They are incredibly good-y. Moreover, though, of course, it's about exploring potential sites for your next cities. More on that in a minute. Fighting, taking land, or buddying up with city-states. Find them first, and you'll get a little bit more money as well. The benefits of early exploration are therefore pretty profound. You cannot play through the rest of your game without doing it. So while my advice is to ditch the scouts, because by and large they're not really worth their cost, and you're better off just having some military units and maybe lucking into a free one, don't negate the power of early exploration. Of course, one other thing that you'll want to bear in mind is that the tech tree and the culture tree have some eurekas to do with exploring the map, finding a new continent, meeting a certain number of city-states, so on and so forth. So do keep that in the front of your mind, but a little bit perversely, maybe don't go exploring with your scouts, because frankly, they're just not quite good enough. My next point could actually be the most important one in the entire video, and it's down here in the bottom left. Map tax. But more importantly, actually, I'm talking about adjacency bonuses, about district, about where you place your cities, and how you should place them in proximity to each other. First things first, though, the map tax themselves. Take a look. When you place down a map tax and click a tile on the map, you can hover over all of these and study their adjacencies. Here you can see a market quarter will provide me with 2 money, thanks to the rivers next door. Maybe I want to plan to build one here, still 2 money, all good. However, if I then decide that I want to place, say, a government plaza, you can see the yields have changed. It'll now give me +4. An important side note here, I do use a couple of sort of UI mods in Civilization 6. I don't like to change the base gameplay experience too much, but I do like to add some extra niceties around the edges. First link in the description will be a video where you can see all of the mods that I'm using. There are only a few, and how to download them as well. Back to the map tacks though, you can see here that I'm playing around between science and faith, figuring out which one works better with the landscape, with the adjacent mountains or the forests. And I can go back through and just delete all of my map tacks and keep the map nice and clean and fresh if I want to. It's important also to note that I can place map tacks down literally wherever I like across the world, so you can really take this to the extreme and plan out not just one city, but your second and your third and your fourth and your fifth and so on and so forth. This will likely benefit you down the line, but if you're a player like me that is perhaps not interested in planning out every single little detail, but just kind of capturing the overall feel of the cities, I have some more general advice for you here too. Firstly, district adjacency bonuses, some in particular, off the top of my head, the industrial quarter, amenities as well, are shared between cities that are sort of nearby, cities that are close to each other, within a certain number of tiles. The effects and radius can be changed with culture cards or technologies down the line, but by and large, you want to remember that cities close together is probably a better idea. Even if you don't quite know that that city's going to be an industrial one because it's got 3 stone, or that that city's going to be a harbour city with lots of trade, it doesn't quite matter. The key is that you keep your cities close. This will help share adjacency bonuses from districts, not just those ones that reach out and give things to other cities, but also you might be able to, say, build a government plaza in one city, and then build another city nearby, and build adjacency bonuses off that. Or potentially you end up with campuses next to each other, or you can get all sorts of crazy things so long as your cities are close together. The same goes, of course, with building wonders. This really is a fundamental part of Civilization 6, is to try and keep your cities close. Of course, this bleeds through into the loyalty mechanic as well, which you'll see a little bit in this video. Settling too close to somebody else will hurt your city's loyalty, and that could eventually end in it flipping out of your control, rebelling against you and joining the enemy. So it's important to keep your cities close, keep your friends close, and keep your enemies, actually in this case, slightly further away. The other final sort of point around city planning and map tacks, but actually thinking more broadly about the map itself, is to consider the natural features and the resources. So natural features, largely we're looking at water. Fresh water is incredibly important in Civilization 6, not just for food, but for housing and all sorts. So you want to make sure, ideally, that you've got a river. You could also, if you need to, go on a coastal tile or a lake, something like that. It's important to note, though, that the coastal tiles are nowhere near as good as the actual fresh water sources themselves. So try and hunt out fresh water. And then, of course, you'll be looking at actual tile yields, as we discussed at the start. Production is key. But do also take note, of course, of the luxury resources around you. They will provide some happiness to your people, or the strategic resources too, if you're looking to go on that militaristic route instead. I've already touched a little bit on scouts, for example. Maybe not quite as good as building slingers in a lot of cases. But one of the other important things that you need to have in your mind when you're going into Civilization 6 is exactly kind of what you want to build, how you want to build it, what your game plan is. But when you focus in at the start, it can be a little bit difficult. How do I balance my culture and my science and my army and all of these kinds of things? Generally, of course, you want to try and reach out and get a little bit of everything. You're going to need some science for your tech tree. You're going to need some culture for your cultural policies. But more importantly, I think the advice here is grow. Grow your army and grow your number of cities. Because in Civilization 6, more cities is almost always better. Unlike Civilization games of the past, particularly Civ 5, where there was a real distinction between a few civs that could play tall, or most civs that could play tall, and very few that could play what we call wide, stretching out across the map, spamming out a whole load of cities. In Civilization 6, that is much easier, and generally speaking, you want to just build as many cities as you possibly can. And that would be my fundamental advice. Now, to front load that and to ensure that you can do that, you'd also need to make sure that you have your military online. Thankfully, we've already covered that a little bit by building slingers. This was something that I always neglected to do when I was first playing Civilization 6. I don't know if it was because I came from Civ 5 or because I was playing other strategy games where the AI was a little less aggressive at the start or something, but in Civilization 6, you do need an army from the get-go. Not only will you be bombarded with barbarian scouts like I'm being here, but their encampments will also start to spin spearmen or mounted units at you, and you may not have something to counter them. It is the early game where these barbarians are at their strongest, therefore. I mean, yes, they can bring tanks later in the piece, but if you're not keeping up with them by then, the game is probably already lost. It's early where it matters, and that's why building your army at the start is fundamentally important. For loads of reasons, though. Not just so that you can go out and explore the land to build more cities, because like I say, more cities is almost always the best thing to do, but also you'll be able to defend the tiles that you're improving. You need to keep your improvements at least functional, otherwise your empire will cripple. Therefore, having a standing army, at least to defend most of your cities, is fundamental for growth, okay? And this is something that I really just want to hammer home here before I move on to the next point. You need to have a base standing army to keep everything moving smoothly. Unexpected things happen all of the time in Civilization 6. It's not just the barbarians, of course. It's your opponents. It's the real threat of other civs that will be constantly threatening you. So let's transition over into a slightly different setting and move on to my next point. And it's really about trade, but also about purchasing, about making these decisions. But firstly, let me tell you about trade, because this was something that, again, I had neglected coming into Civilization 6. I want to build settlers, I want to build my army, I want to get my science online. Trade routes tended to fall by the wayside for me. I'm here to tell you that that is probably not a wise thing. Even if you can't produce them, you could always save up your gold to purchase them in your cities. A little bit more about purchasing in a minute, but firstly, those trade routes do three key things that you might not know. Firstly, obviously, they're going to be fantastic for raising money, or internal trade routes for raising food and production. Internal trade routes actually quite useful, maybe more than you think. The second reason, of course, is that your trade routes will lay down roads, and if you're not playing like I am as Rome, you'll need those to move through your empire faster, but also potentially to move to the enemy's empire. Don't forget, when you send a trade route to, say, a city-state or an enemy city, it will build a road there as well. In Civilization 6, we don't really, especially early, build our roads ourselves. Our traders will do it for us. So we need to make sure that we're connecting trade routes where we want to lay down our roads. And third and finally, the internal trade routes. And there are some civilizations in particular that really benefit from internal trade. But the important thing to note is that when you establish these trade routes, they will establish trading posts, and that will improve the value of the trade route. So there is also some value in keeping it consistent and building the routes, building the roads, and the trading posts. You'll really benefit from keeping the number of trade routes you have high and making sure that you have those trade routes active. Really attentive viewers will note how this relates to my previous point too. You need to protect your trade routes. They can be pillaged like any other unit, and if they're traveling quite far, they might not always be exactly where you're looking. They might have stretched out off the screen, going to a city far and wide. Another vital reason for keeping military units nearby to defend those trade routes. Finally, on trade and purchasing, I think it's important that we reflect also back at the starting point that production is king. And so there's some value in establishing these internal trade routes to add a little bit of extra production where you may need it. Also, don't forget, another couple quick tips you can do is use your workers to chop down woods to funnel that industry in. I'm sure regular players of Civilization already knew that, but it's important for me just to mention it here toward the end of the video that you can surge production into a city. Whether you're building a campus like I'm trying to do, these are all terrible places for one, or whether you're building a wonder, or maybe even using it to rush out your settlers. It's always useful to be able to send a worker onto a tile with some trees and chop it down. The technology for it is unlocked very early. It's a go-to strategy for most Civ players, so it would be really unjust for me not to mention it here. Even though it was already something technically that I knew from playing previous Civ games, it must be mentioned. So, what have we discussed? Let me bring it through into a summary, whether you're skipping to this through the time cards or whether you've listened to all of the detail. Firstly, city planning is fundamental, and we can use little things, maybe extra mods, but crucially, we can use our map tacks to think about where we're going to place our cities. Always, ideally, want to try and place our cities close to each other, though, so that they can share in district adjacencies or shared bonuses. We'll also, of course, be looking out for resources on the map that will make our people happy or give them weapons to fight with. And lastly, we should note that some districts in particular share special bonuses with certain natural features, campuses like mountains, for example. So make sure you take a look at that. Next, we talked about ditching the scouts. See ya! I would prefer, generally, and my general advice would be to build slingers instead of scouts. Useful, of course, for extra defense, extra strength, and we can still hopefully get out there, meet people, and ideally stumble across a few goody huts and maybe luck into a scout. I wouldn't count on lucking into one. You don't generally need one, and if you really do find that it would be beneficial, I'd recommend building no more than one. We know that production is king, and we know that trade routes can help us early on, not just with that, but with all of our yields, and crucially, connecting our cities via roads. And last, but absolutely not least, the more the merrier. So get out there, place those cities down, and ensure that you have a standing army ready to defend, perhaps ready to attack and take something nearby. An opportunistic strike might just present itself. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time for some more Civilization 6. Take care, everybody.